Good afternoon for everybody who's joined in. We will be getting started shortly. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes until some other people sign in. Thanks for your attendance today. Okay, so it is just about 2 o'clock, so we are going to get this session started. Just because we do want to ensure that there is enough time to get all our information in and hear from the participants on the call today. So if anybody does join in late, we'll do our very best to catch them up to where we are. So first of all, I just want to welcome everybody. Today is Cavan Monaghan's ward boundary review information session. A little bit about what we're going to do today. So the point of today is really to, as part of the public engagement phase of this ward boundary review process, we're holding virtual information sessions really as a way to make residents of the municipality aware of what we're doing. And more importantly, to start to talk about some of the preliminary options that we've come up with in terms of ward boundary designs, and then to hear your questions, your comments, and your feedback with regard to the process so far and those options that we're going to begin to walk you through and talk a little bit about today, and also a little bit about our thinking and what we were trying to do with some of these ward boundary alternatives. So before we get into the session, a little bit of introduction so you know who the consultant team is that's working on this project and who was selected by your municipality, and obviously who's going to be talking to you today. So my name is Jack Amendolia. I'm a partner at a firm called Watson and Associates. Watson's a firm that does a lot of work for municipalities and school boards throughout Ontario and Canada. A lot of the work we do is really based in population forecasting, residential forecasting, how settlement patterns are going to change for municipalities, and obviously the impacts of those. And we've been doing a lot of work with Cavan historically, so we're quite aware of the municipality, quite informed about the individual issues that affect your municipality and how we think it's going to grow going forward. And to joining me on this call and as part of this project today is a colleague of mine, Josh Valenti. He's a consultant at Watson. Josh's specialty is really in what I just spoke about, that population forecasting, geographic information systems, modeling of those populations going forward, because that plays a vital role in any ward boundary review. And that's really where Watson comes into this study, is dealing with those population metrics and how it impacts the ward boundary review in terms of ensuring that there are very, or as equal as possible, populations amongst the different wards. And that's a term that you're going to hear that we've spoken about during this review, and we'll talk about today, is representation by population. However, it's important to note that this is not just a population exercise, and this is not just a computer exercise in terms of dividing up your municipality and finding the exact populations that work. There are a set of guiding principles that help us evaluate your system and help us evaluate any redesigns that we may make. And when we talk about those systems, we'll see that it's much more than population. And to that end, Watson has a long-standing relationship with Dr. Robert Williams, who you see on your screen. I'm going to refer to him more informally today, as he likes to be called, as Bob. And Bob is a retired professor of political science from the University of Waterloo. In Bob's retirement, he started a second career, so to speak, doing ward boundary reviews for many municipalities across Ontario. And we started a relationship with Bob, like I said, about a decade ago, really joining forces in terms of us bringing the population side that I spoke about, and Bob bringing his experience with electoral systems, municipal governance, and municipal affairs to the equation as well. And like I said, we'll talk a lot more throughout today's session about how those different core principles help us make up or redesign some alternative ward boundaries for you. So with regard to tonight's session, what we're going to do first is Josh is going to bring up a presentation that we prepared for you. Bob and I are going to walk you through this presentation, and this early part of today's session is really meant to provide a little bit of background. Like I was saying, tell you a little bit about the methodologies and the process we use during a ward boundary review, a little bit about the legislation and what that says about a ward boundary review process, with the intention of really setting the table a bit so that when we talk about the preliminary options that we've come up with, you have some like I said, background and context to make a little bit more sense about what we're going to be discussing in the options. So as I mentioned, we're going to start out in a couple of seconds. Bob will walk you through the legislative framework and the process that we use. We'll talk a bit about why are we doing a ward boundary review? Ultimately, what is the outcome? What are we trying to do here? We'll mention about what we've heard so far. So I talked about these virtual information sessions being a part of the public engagement, but this is round two, and we already had an initial round where we did hear some early feedback on this review. So we'll talk a little bit about what we've heard so far, evaluate the system, and then, as I mentioned, get into the actual preliminary ward boundary option. So at this stage of the game, I'm going to pass things over to Bob, and as I mentioned, he's going to walk you through some of those frameworks and methodologies that we use. Bob?
Thank you, Jack. The first place to start is to look at what we're calling here the context of this review. What is the structure in place in Cavan Monaghan? Where did it come from? And what are the matters that we might want to look at? But let's just make sure we're all on the same page, if you will, on this. Cavan Monaghan, of course, was an amalgamation of the townships of Cavan and North Monaghan with the village of Millbrook back in 1998. It started with a big long name and eventually was renamed the township of Cavan Monaghan. 1998, the structure put in place then were 3 wards, each electing 1 councillor, and those wards essentially followed the boundaries of those 3 pre-amalgamation municipalities. So that's 22 years ago. We understand from some of the research that we've done is that in 2015, there was some discussion about a ward boundary review, but for various reasons, it was not followed through. And so that same 1998 structure is still operative. So the current review is brought about by the fact that there has been, as we'll see, I believe on the next slide, some significant growth in the population of the township since 1998, around 20%, but it's not been evenly distributed across the township. Growth has taken place in some areas and not in others. So the council structure that we're dealing with, 3 local councillors, 1 elected in each ward, and 2 other officers elected at large, a mayor and a deputy mayor, and those 2 individuals sit on the Peterborough County Council to represent Cavan Monaghan. So a 5-member council essentially operating under the same arrangements were in place in 1998. So the next slide is a very quick summary of the change we're talking about. These are not large numbers by Ontario standards, perhaps, fairly typical of many rural municipalities, but the population at amalgamation was smaller than this, but it is now 10,300 distributed across 3 wards. We also understand from information we've gathered through the township and the county that there will be further growth. And we know a lot of this is driven by rules and regulations coming out of the province. But we know there's growth. We know they're looking at a growth of about 1,400 people over the next 10 years. And as we've suggested, this is not likely to be happening evenly across the municipality. So a ward boundary review, what kinds of things could go into that? And it's important to go back to realize that much of the decision many of the decisions around this are actually made by your council. So the Municipal Act provides 3 features or 3 responsibilities that what's called a lower tier municipality can undertake. And a lower tier meaning you're part of the county of Peterborough. So Cavan Monaghan is a lower tier municipality. Peterborough County is the upper tier. So legislation 2001 says you have the authority rather to change the size of your council. Your council is 5 members. That is the minimum size of a municipal council in Ontario. And that is something that is open to your community to change through the council if it so desires. It can also determine how the council members can be elected. The mayor must be elected at large. That perspective, again, is built into the legislation. But the other 4 offices could be filled in a couple of different ways. And that's the third component that the municipal council actually has the opportunity to what is called divide or redivide the municipality into wards or to dissolve the existing wards. So if you don't have wards, you can create them. If you have wards and you don't want to keep them, you can dissolve them, or you can redivide the wards that are there. So beyond that, the legislation is quite limited. The legislation doesn't provide a schedule. That's one of the reasons why Cavan Monaghan has not reviewed this in 20 some years. There's no schedule. There's no standardized process. There are no criteria that the province provides to say, this is what you must look at. This is when you must look at it. This is what is involved in such a review. So what we mean by that then is that each municipality must set its own terms of reference for this review. And that has happened. It's one of the factors that led to our being selected to do this. There is no standardized process, and there are no criteria that are to be brought to bear. So the first bullet there is saying each municipality must set its own terms, its own parameters, its own guiding principles. And that is what we are working under. These are the ones that were established for Cavan Monaghan by Cavan Monaghan. We obviously have contributed to the kind of process that's going forward. And we do that because we've had considerable experience doing this, and we have developed a process that we believe is appropriate, and that's drawn by procedures and principles that we've seen at work in other Ontario municipalities. Not that we simply pick those up and import them, but we learn from those and work around the particular characteristics of Cavan Monaghan to come up with a process that's suitable for your municipality. It's also important that we look at what kinds of principles and practices have been followed and may have been subject to review by what was the Ontario Municipal Board, now the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal. Those are also helpful to us to understand what a successful ward boundary would look like. And there is one important judicial decision related to representation that becomes a key part of what we're doing. So back to Jack.
Thanks, Bob. I just want to take a second, just because we noticed something happening in the chat. Obviously, if someone noticed those chat comments coming through, it seems that we were Zoom bombed. So it obviously wasn't coming from our side. That whoever's made those comments has been removed from the chat, but we can't seem to, we're trying our best to get rid of them, but I just wanted to point that out as we move on. So one of the unfortunate circumstances of our virtual world that we're in now. So hopefully that hasn't caused too much of a disturbance, and we're going to move on. So getting back to the presentation. So thanks, Bob, for walking us through the legislative framework, the process, what we try to do with regard to our methodologies. The next phase is what I'm going to talk about is what we're trying to focus on. As I mentioned a little while ago, we had two phases to this project. In phase one, we really focused on awareness, trying to get information out, trying to have an understanding and an information exchange about what makes your municipality unique, things that we should be aware of before we start to reconfigure some of the ward boundary existing configurations. And in phase two, it really gets more into that technical aspect that we were talking about, where we deal more with population forecasting, modeling, getting a sense of how your municipality is going to grow, and more importantly, where and how that's going to impact ward boundary populations. From then, so now at a point where we have learning about your municipality, like I said, knowing sort of the local and unique circumstances, combining that now with the technical and population and data modeling aspect, we can start to actually develop preliminary ward boundary options. And that's where we're at today. So we're now at finish number 2 and into the number 3 public consultation phase of this phase 2 to learn or to present the ward boundary options to you and to learn about what you may like and what you may not like, and more importantly, why you may or may not like that. And then from there, we take that feedback again, and from there, we develop some final ward boundary options. So really the next step after this round of public engagement is to prepare a final options report, and that will then go to your council, and then council has the ability to make some final decisions on this ward boundary system. So if we move to the next slide, just a quick review of some of the things that I just talked about and some of the things we're trying to do, and really building off that last point. Ultimately, through public engagement, through the different reports, we're trying to provide the information that your council needs to make a decision on either whether to maintain the existing ward system that you have, whether to have an alternative arrangement. And that alternative arrangement, again, is ultimately council's decision. That could be one of the options that we present to council. That could be an option that they want to come up with, that they might say, can you combine a little bit of option 1 and a little bit of option 3 and develop a hybrid option? Or, as Bob talked about with regards to the legislative framework, they also have the decision to completely dissolve wards and go to an at-large system. So those are really what the options are ultimately going to be when it comes time for council to decide. Just a quick reminder, Bob went through this, but right now your representation on Peterborough County Council is made up of the mayor and deputy mayor, and both those positions are elected at large and are not part of our purvey. So as part of this review, they will continue to be elected at large. We're strictly looking at the ward boundaries themselves. And as we mentioned, right now, Cavan Monaghan is divided into 3 wards, and each elects 1 local area councillor. And those wards are based on the pre-amalgamation municipalities that formed or that were formed or created when Cavan Monaghan was created. So we talk about some questions that we try to answer in a ward boundary review, and some of them tend to be a little bit high level. How well does the present structure serve the residents of Cavan Monaghan? Does the present electoral structure provide fair and effective representation? And we get a bit cheeky in the first engagement, and we say, if the answer to those questions are yes, and we think that the existing structure is doing its job and providing fair and effective representation, then really as a consultant team, we tell that to your council. And, we, in essence, we pack up our bags and we go home and we say, there's really no reason to continue this review or for us to come up with ward boundaries. However, if we tend to answer no, that we see some issues or deficiencies in the existing system, then we have to ask that third question: might an alternative system provide better representation for the citizens of Cavan Monaghan? And that's really what we're going to, as Bob takes you through the next slide, that's really what we're going to try to answer. What are, number one and two, do we think that the current system works? And we're going to provide an evaluation of that. And then if not, is there a system that might work better? And then we'll get into that as well. So I'll turn it back over to Bob at this point.
All right, thank you, Jack. Yes, we've come through phase one. We're now into phase two, but phase one was not simply the consultants coming in and telling the community what is the appropriate way to address these issues. We worked with the community, working through staff to make sure that we got some sense of your community from the members, the residents of your community. We started with some interviews with senior staff. We interviewed all members of councils. Some of those interviews are still going on to help us, again, understand where your community is and where it will be going over the next decade or so. We conducted 2 public online town hall sessions, meetings like this, where members of the community were able to hear some background and provide some perspectives to us on what we were asked to review. There is a website on the municipal site dealing specifically with the ward boundary review. And there are a number of materials that we've prepared that are posted there for members of the community to go back and have a look at. We also conducted a survey, allowed individuals who were interested to give us some thoughts about the exercise, the process that we're following, some of the kinds of issues around the principles that we're going to talk about in a moment, and help us understand your municipality. There were some fairly extensive responses that we got, and we had a number of ways of getting the message out and getting the message back. We understand that there were over 3,000 views of the various social media posts that went out through the township's own site. We don't handle that part. We work with your structure, but over 3,000 views of that information. 20 people responded to the survey, many of them leaving thoughtful explanations of their choices. The number is not as important as the kinds of perspectives that we hear. We'd like more people, clearly, but it is a process of information gathering. It's not a vote. It's not a poll. It's a way to help us understand your community and what the electoral system might look like. Among those responses, the majority were from Cavan Ward, but as we'll see in a moment, Cavan Ward is overwhelmingly the largest ward by population, so that's not surprising. But there were people who contributed to this response from all of the wards. So what are the general things that we heard? The next slide tells us very quickly about some of that, and more of this will be discussed in future reports. Many of the respondents identified the population disparities as what they viewed as a hindrance to effective representation. And again, that is a glaring fact. There is a wide disparity in the population of the wards, and there was a thought that this did not make for a system of fair or effective representation. And if we're going to look at some changes, that would be the place to start. Half of the respondents did, though, feel that the boundaries accurately reflected their interests. They were well represented, but the other half didn't. So it was not a clear-cut perspective, and that's an important sign that we need to at least consider why that would be the case. The third point here, I think, comes back to that. Some of the residents really felt that what we call their community of interest was not well represented by the current wards. And what that comes down to is that the current boundaries actually do not encompass what we might call a coherent community. We're looking at that issue, for example, in the boundary between North Monaghan Ward and Cavan Ward, where those settlement areas, some are in one ward, some are in the other. The more important example of that, though, is around Millbrook, where we've now seen in the course of the last, since the wards were created, a considerable amount of population settlement outside the boundaries of the old village of Millbrook. But in this system, those people are captured within Cavan Ward, which really runs the whole length of the municipality. So people who are, in a sense, part of the Millbrook community actually vote in a different ward. And those are issues that we I think are reflected in that second bullet. And one of the things that would lead us to say, can we bring those into better alignment? So what did we determine? We've had a look at this. This is, if you will, the early diagnosis, the kind of quick take based on what we've heard and what we've seen when we examine it. So in phase one and in the report that was done around that, we focused on an assessment of the present ward system to see whether it provides, the term we use is effective representation. We'll explain that term a little more in a few minutes, but that's in the end, the overall assessment that we want to make. Are people able to be effectively represented in the current ward configuration? And the particular points that follow are part of that analysis. Cavan Ward, as I'm sure everyone on the call would know, Cavan Ward is disproportionately large in two respects, in terms of population and in geography. It is simply not a comparable entity. That's one ward is of one type, of large geography, large population. The other two wards are much smaller in both population and in geography. That is not a recipe for effective representation. The population disparities between the wards are in fact expected to worsen through the next 3 election cycles. Areas of growth, primarily but not exclusively around Millbrook, will continue to contribute to this imbalance that we've just talked about. The other third one, again, we've touched on this already. The wards tend not to have boundaries that accurately reflect the communities within those wards. The communities of 5 Mile Turn, Springville, and parts of Millbrook are split between wards. They are one place in terms of the people who live there, but electorally they're in 2 different wards. The boundary itself may not look like or may not appear to be something we need to consider, but part of the goal is that the boundaries should make it possible for people to understand which ward they're in. And I think we get the feeling that the way the boundaries are drawn, and I'll focus exclusively at the moment on Millbrook, tend not to relate to the way the settlement has grown. The boundaries don't match. And so it's important, I think, for, again, effective representation for people to say, I know which ward I'm in because the line does not cut through my neighborhood or doesn't separate me from my immediate neighbors. It is a boundary that I can understand and becomes an important part of how I view my representation. So we've talked a lot about population disparity. The next slide reflects that very clearly, that looking at 2021 with the orange bars on the left, the gap is pretty startling. 7,300 roughly in Cavan Ward, down to under 1,300 in North Monaghan Ward. That is not a population parity by any means. And then the growth that we're talking about, again, primarily around Millbrook, but actually in Cavan Ward, pushes that division, that disparity even further. The 2030 population, and we should make it very clear, our mandate was to look at a system to apply over the next 3 elections, 2022, 2026, 2030. But as we look at 2030, where we should have in terms of population parity, 3 wards of roughly 33% of the population, you've got 1 ward that is twice that size and another one that is 1/3 of it. So population isn't everything, but this is clearly a distribution that calls for at least some careful review and determination about its impact on the way representation occurs within Cavan Monaghan. The next slide is a little harder perhaps to read easily, but it's giving you a sense of how we want to look at those distributions. Our goal is to have all of the wards within an optimal population range. That would be the population divided by 3 and within 5% of that. Most municipalities will not have every ward within that. So we recognize that you've got some very different kinds of settlement patterns, different kinds of interests. So we allow for a bit of flexibility. So in this category, what we call above or below optimal would be roughly anywhere from 5 to 25%. Pretty generous range, but it is something that we believe can be folded into a successful ward system. But if you move outside of that 25% above or below, clearly the ward does not meet the kinds of expectations related to both the current population, the 2021, or the 2030. So we want to make sure that those kinds of bright red cells don't appear when we look at the population distributions within the municipality. So the next slide is simply a quick overview of the wards themselves. And the point that we've made already about the geography is pretty clear. One ward very much clustered around a single settlement area. Another ward in North Monaghan, a little larger, but an awful lot of that territory is not, of course, residential. There's a lot of employment lands in there, including the Peterborough Airport and other kinds of peripheral activities. So its population tends not to be evenly distributed even within the ward. And then, of course, Cavan, large territory, lots of agricultural land, but also a series of smaller settlements scattered across that landscape that are currently in a single ward. Back to Jack.
Thanks, Bob, for that evaluation. So after looking at what the existing system looks like, some of the issues that Bob identified with the existing system, we get back into the questions that I was asking earlier. And ultimately, we ask the question, do we think that the existing wards need to be changed? So I think if you've been listening to us so far, you listened to the evaluation Bob just did on the existing system, our answer is yes. We do feel that the existing wards do need to be changed, or at least need to be considered to be changed. And to that end, we are going to provide some options to consider. One thing we do quickly want to talk about is that as part of this evaluation, and we mentioned this a couple of times with regard to council's decisions, it's looking at the existing ward system, determining whether the wards need to be changed. But one of council's decisions is also to dissolve the ward. So obviously part of our review in examining the system might come back and tell council, hey, we don't think that a ward system is really working for your municipality right now. To that end, based on our evaluation and based on what we've heard from the public, I mean, we did hear a comment here or there about whether a ward system is something that's still useful in Cavan, but the vast majority of comments that we did hear from the public, we didn't hear much about dissolving the wards. So based on the public feedback, based on our opinion, and you know, and there's some pros and cons, I think, to ward systems and at-large systems, but in this case, considering the makeup of your municipality, we still think a ward system is what's appropriate. Before we talk a little bit more about next steps, I also want to point out that when we talk about ward systems and we evaluate against these core principles or guiding principles that we've spoken about at length today, it's very difficult to have a system that is going to completely check all the boxes, that is going to say, yeah, we have perfect population parity and we've perfectly identified all the communities of interest, and we've met all the core principles perfectly. And really the reason for that is just reality and practicality. When we think about how wards exist, where current boundary lines are, how settlements grow, the push and pull between urban and rural, and the differences in those concentrations of populations. In most areas of Ontario, it's really difficult to have a perfect system. But what we try to do is balance those priorities as best as we can when we're trying to figure out some redesigns. So in terms of some next steps, what are we going to do? So our immediate next step is we developed a preliminary options report, and that's available on the website, that really outlines what we're about to talk about in a couple of minutes. Again, as we talked about before, we're in that public engagement stage. So it's not just about these open houses, but we talked about the survey, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. But there's other tools available to get your thoughts out to the municipality and to the consultant team. So really that's the next few weeks is really trying to continue this flow of information exchange and get some feedback about what you think about these options and some preferences. And then, as I talked about earlier, it's really about developing a final ward boundary option or options to your council, and then council can select either one of those options presented, can select the existing system, or as we talked about, can select to dissolve the wards and move to an at-large system. So a couple of things left for you to do as we move towards that final option stage. So please visit the webpage. We've talked about it a couple of times, but it's really acting as a central warehouse of information right now. So if you can go there, we'll talk about this in a second, but survey, discussion papers, there's a really cool mapping tool that you can put in your address, and it shows you where you live and how that may change, and how that ward you live in may change depending on the options we present. So go check it out, read as much as you can, get informed, and then fill in the avenues that we have for you for feedback. I talked about the survey. It's a really good way, and all of the ways are good ways to give us your feedback, but the survey really gives us a nice, consistent way to analyze some of the results and some of the questions that we're asking. So I kind of say, if you only do one thing in this process, make it the survey and go and fill out the survey. And the more people that know about this, the better. The more we can make people aware and informed, and the more feedback and results we get, I think the better recommendation that we're going to be able to make to your council. So please tell everybody you know about this process and all the different information I just spoke about. So that's it for this initial information, or this initial presentation. And now, like we said at the beginning of today's session, we're going to jump into the actual preliminary options that we've developed. So in a second, Josh is going to bring up the slides with the options. But before we get into that, you're going to see a couple of the first slides just reiterate some of the information we went through today. So we talked about guiding principles and the importance of those guiding principles. And Bob said in his presentation, we're not just making these lines up out of thin air. We're not just drawing, random lines on a map to see, how those look in terms of ward boundaries, but we really have these guiding principles that help formulate these different options that we come up with. So again, I think we did a pretty good job of going through them in the presentation. I don't want to waste a lot more time belaboring them and going through them again, but just keep them in mind as we go through the options. And you'll probably hear us a couple of times relate back to some of the guiding principles in terms of what we were trying to do with some of the options. If we look at the next slide, oh, Bob, you wanted to mention something?
Yeah, just a quick comment, Jack. Sorry to just go back there. This is not a case of either or. You pick one principle or another one and drive the whole exercise on the basis of a single one. They've all got to be taken into account. And what we're going to see are some scenarios in which some of these are given a little more emphasis than others. Again, as we suggested a couple of times, it's highly unlikely that any single design will hit all four of those marks at the same level. But in effective representation is how we put all of those together to capture the particular features of your municipality.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. That's a really good point, and we get those questions a lot. And it'll become evident, I think, as we talk about some of these options, that there is tension between some of these guiding principles. Sometimes they're not we got asked the other night, are they weighted? Is it 25%, 25%? And the answer is no. I mean, it really depends on the unique circumstances, and it depends on the option that we're talking about in that time, because there is some push-pull within the principles themselves. So when we look at the next slide, it's really just what we looked at in the presentation. So again, very quickly, just keep this in the back of your mind as we're talking about the options, because we will start to make some references about the existing system. So just remember, it's that 3-ward system. The options we're going to look at: maintain 3 wards. We do have some significant population disparity that Bob went through in his presentation. So, and even from a community of interest point of view, when we look at some of the ward boundary lines, let's remember that, we have some boundary lines that are going right through some communities, right through some built up boundaries. We have situations where a good chunk of Millbrook is in the Cavan ward, a good chunk of future growth of Millbrook is in the Cavan ward. So keep these sort of principles in mind and issues in mind as we walk through some of the options.
And if I may, Jack, just a couple of thoughts. Given that we're now 22 years into the life of the township of Cavan Monaghan, and that the electoral structures were based on municipalities that date a long way back, do those identities still matter? They may in some respects, but they don't necessarily have to become the basis for electing members of council. The communities will still be there. The entities that are on the map, if you will still exist. We're just thinking about how to regroup them to elect council in a more equitable manner.
Perfect. Thanks, Bob. Okay, so let's jump into the options. So as we said, we're going to present 4 options to you today, and they all assume the same thing: 3 wards, 1 area councillor per ward, mayor and deputy mayor continue to be elected at large. So those are the constants throughout these options. So in preliminary option 1, you see 2 northern wards, 1 southern ward. A couple of things that we'll note is that Millbrook is contained, as I just mentioned. Now it's actually in between 2 wards. In this option, we have Millbrook contained solely within 1 ward. Again, when we look at things like population parity and think about the existing system, where we had wards ranging, I think, from about 1,200 up to about 8,000. Again, population parity in this example, is it perfect? No. But is it better than the existing system? Much. And in a couple of wards, we're quite close to that optimal range. A couple of wards were slightly below and slightly above. But again, it's really what Bob said. We're not trying to do just population parity. We're trying to balance the other guiding principles, so you get as close as you can in population parity, still trying to heed some of the other principles we talked about. Bob, some other highlights in this option?
Well, one of the points of the trade-off is that even with that expanded Ward 1, which is essentially North Monaghan moving out further west, there is still not enough population to bring that up to the ideal size without, again, let's say, moving across to County Road 10, which splits other communities. And that's the kind of issue we're talking about. Another line might in fact help us address population, but would divide existing communities. So we've worked with an intermediate line to create, I think, a different approach to it, and then relied on other lines where we could, the 115 Larmer line, just as a way to keep those areas separated with an identifiable marker. But again, because the density of population in the Millbrook and greater area means that Ward 3 is going to be a little higher. Now, the absolute numbers are not great. The balance is a bit better than the current system. But again, it shows you the constraints that we need to work around.
Thanks, Bob. And thanks for mentioning that point about the absolute numbers. I think that's an important one here as well. When we work in some of the smaller municipalities, we do have to pay attention to those absolute numbers. Again, if we were talking in a place of a population of 300,000 or 400,000, when we're talking about 140% of the optimal range, that absolute range can get quite large. In this situation, even though we're a little bit below and a little bit above, the range that we're talking about is still about 2,300 to about 4,700. So we're not talking about a huge difference in absolute populations. If we move to option two, one thing you'll see in terms of comparing to the existing system and the option that we just looked at in option one is that northern ward looks quite different. So we have that northern ward that basically goes east to west across the entire northern portion of the municipality. And then in the southern portion, we have basically a quadrant type ward surrounding Millbrook with an inverted L that surrounds that Ward 3, as we're calling it in this example. Millbrook is still contained solely within one ward, but its association with some of the periphery area in this example is a little bit different than when we looked at in option one. Cavan as well, still contained solely within one ward. Again, a little bit of a different configuration to what we know now. From a population parity perspective, very, very good in 2021, especially considering the different things we talked about that we have to balance, all within sort of that 25% optimal range, and one ward right on, pretty much right on the ideal population at Ward 1 at 1.04. Again, with some of the growth, and most of that growth is concentrated in that Millbrook or in that Ward 3 area. Some of those numbers get a little bit outside our optimum 25% range. But again, like Bob pointed out in option one, when we look at it from an absolute range, still about 2,500 to 5,500. So fairly decent range in absolute population. Bob?
Well, again, this is a matter of stepping back and saying, maybe there's another way to do it. And if I pick up on the point I made earlier, if we want to go over and capture the areas, the Mount Pleasants and Ida's in the same ward, and then we move across from there, there's no other obvious line to use. So we basically said, let's try a northern ward. We get a pretty good population distribution. So it's not the old Cavan or the old North Monaghan, but it is a way of creating a sense of connection, because we know that there is a lot of movement, if you will, across into Peterborough. That would mean that that area has a certain amount of connection that would be there. Millbrook, we've run into the same issue. We're basically saying, let's take a quadrant from Millbrook and work out to the eastern side rather than crossing the 115. Let's keep it down there. And that again creates other kinds of ripples because the growth is concentrated in Millbrook, but that area on the other side, let's at least keep that within some connection to Millbrook. And the Ward 2 in here becomes the kind of, I hate to call it a leftover, but it's the parts that fits into, it is the part rather that fits into the lines that we want to use here to create that distinctive impression that we talked about earlier.
Great, thank you, Bob. So when we look at option three, we're going to recognize, if we sort of think back to what we talked about in option one, we're going to recognize some pretty striking similarities to option one. However, a couple of things that you'll notice that are different. The Ward 2 in this example goes all the way south to the southern end of the municipality, right to the city limits. So a larger ward there. And what that does is it creates a more compact Millbrook ward, a little bit similar, a little slightly larger than option two, but some similarities there. And what it's doing is we talked about in option one, how it's pretty balanced. We tend to hit some of the things, most of the things we want to hit in terms of the guiding principles, but that Millbrook population gets a bit on the large side and under that option one. And when we incorporate growth, even larger. So this one, we're still a bit on the outside of our 25% optimum ranges in 2021, but better than option one. So it's really that balancing or trade-off that we talk about. You can get a little bit of a large or a little bit better in terms of population parity. Trade-off becomes the Ward 2 in this example gets a bit larger. Bob?
Again, if we go back, when you get a chance to go back and look at option one, you'll see that there are some things that we've used. Let's say that 115 as the boundary between wards 2 and 3 is consistent. Here we've said, let's in fact now use it only for part of it and cross it to get to some other kind of desirable outcome. And again, the concentration around Millbrook is evident in that area south of the 115. But again, that's where a lot of the growth is. And so it ends up on the larger side. One of the possibilities for those who are thinking about it, of course, is that we could somehow mesh option 1 and option 3 in this kind of scenario, and maybe that would be a better balance. But at least for the discussion, we need to talk about other things. Is that relationship across the north that's there in option 2 really that appropriate or not? Is it better to keep some of that distinction in place by having these 2 wards in the north rather than 1?
Thank you, Bob. So our last option that we're going to look at, some similarities to the existing system, that donut with the hole in the middle. There's some elements of option 2 that we see here. So Ward 1 that I talked about in option 2 that runs the north, the entire northern part of the municipality from east to west. That's the same in this one. So again, some elements of what we've discussed, some elements of what we know somewhat. And really what we see in this option is we do manage to still, we think, deal with most of the guiding principles, but we really see the population parity here compared to the other options and the existing system really come to the forefront. So in both 2021 and 2030. So we're not only in the existing short term, but we have pretty good population parity as the municipality grows out over the next decade as well. And you can see that in 2021, all wards within that optimum range, nothing really outside of 11% off that optimum range. And again, from studies that we do and options that we come up with, we consider that very, very good population parity. And even when we go out to 2030, 15% in that ward, in that Millbrook Ward 3, that's the highest outside of the optimal population. So again, as Bob talked about, you're going to see some examples that have a bit of a different bend or a bit of a different focus. I would say this option 4 tries to adhere to all of the guiding principles, but there's definitely a focus on population parity. Bob?
Yeah, a couple of things are important. That population distribution is pretty remarkable, given how close it is to that 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 in the context of Cavan Monaghan, which has got that one major growth center and the rest of the population is distributed differently. To do that, you have to expand that current North Monaghan ward outward. And again, we're picking up themes from the other, one of the other models. This in some ways is a continuation of the present structure where Millbrook itself is surrounded by Cavan. In this case, it's part of the old Cavan, but it's a cleaner set of lines. And a couple of implications come out of that. One is that it is a ward that is different than the other 2, which means in effect, there are 2 rural wards in this scenario. And the rural areas are not, if you will, overwhelmed by the Millbrook population through an expanded ward. And that's a kind of distinction that may be a valuable one, building on, again, the current model, but with clean lines. And I know we keep coming back to this, basically saying, let's keep it different from the rest of the community, or the rest of the municipality, and operate under some dimensions. And those again are there's going to be some rural area enclosed in that, but we don't really have other obvious lines to use that would allow us to say this is a clean kind of arrangement. And even that northern ward, just for the last moment, if we were to say that's, let's increase the population a little bit, then we end up on 7A and we cut right through Cavan. Can't do that. So we're trying to work around having to split communities that happen to lie on those major roadways.
Yeah, I think that last point is really important too. I mean, there are, from a population parity or maybe some other reasons, like you talked about the Millbrook association with some of the rural area, and does that rural area really associate with Millbrook? We've heard a couple of comments about that, and we are listening to them. I don't want to say that because we've drawn the line in a different place that we're ignoring those comments, but it really goes back to what Bob said, and really the theme of today's conversation is about trying to balance all the guiding principles. So we can say, sure, let's draw the line a lot closer to Millbrook, or let's use the Millbrook urban boundary as the line, The problem is the people know where that is, where that line is. Can you go out and say, oh yeah, I know where Ward 1 and Ward 2 or Ward 2 and Ward 3 ends? Because if we use some of those other concepts, that might be right through people's backyards, or it might be dividing lot lines, or not something that's clear and identifiable. And we think that's important for people to be able to be aware and know exactly what ward they live in and where those boundary lines start and end. So that's it from us informing and telling you a little bit about our thinking and different options. At this point, we want to leave some time for comments and questions. So if anybody does have any comments or questions, now's your chance. And you can use you either, I think you can, I'll probably ask Cindy here. I believe participants can either unmute themselves to ask questions or use the chat feature.
Yes, they can do that, Jack. I do see there's some inappropriate conversations going on in the chat here, so I'm not sure exactly how we want to address this truthfully. Maybe we have people just email their comments to you to avoid what's taking place right now. You let me know.
Yeah, we're trying our best to sort of unmute or mute and get those people out, but yeah, somehow I think we've been Zoom bombed or hacked in this session. So yeah, maybe
if Josh
Cindy
wants to transfer the host back to me, I can remove these people from the panel. It does indicate who they are that are making these comments, so we can remove them.
Sure. Yeah, Josh, can you do that?
Yep, I've done that, and I think I've tried to remove them as well, but it's not necessarily allowing it.
You're absolutely right. No, it's not.
So I'm guessing that the session, I don't think, at least from what I know, I don't think it's an individual's computer that was hacked, but I think this session is being hacked and taken over. So out of all the sessions we've done so far, this is a first for us, but we have heard that this is possible on Zoom, and I think that's what's happening. So I don't know, Cindy, if we want to just end the session and do what you said, provide any comments through email or through the website. But I don't know if you have any other suggestions or if IT can do anything.
Oh, look, we don't.
Let's give it 1 second. Can you unshare your screens for me, Josh, as well, please? Yeah, I think, Jack, let's just shut this down. And again, just we can reiterate to people that if they have any comments that they want to submit through the port, like through me, through you, through the website, through the surveys, etc. Thank you very much, though, for your patience.
So we do apologize. I mean, it is an unfortunate circumstance of the environment we're in. The municipality and the consultants have been lucky to this point, but it looks like today, not so much. So again, really do thank everyone's time and attention. We appreciate everyone coming out today. And as Cindy said, if there's any comments or questions that you have, please email us or get in touch with us through the website, or even leave some comments in the survey, and we'll do our best, absolute best, to get in touch with you and address those comments.
And we could, in fact, reach out to anyone who wants to talk to us separately. We could do that sometime in the next few days, the next couple of weeks or so.
Wonderful. And on the website as well, there is, if you have any more questions, please contact. And as soon as you click that link, it brings everything to me. So please feel free to use that avenue as well, right through the website.
Okay, great. Apologies again, unfortunate circumstance, but do appreciate everybody's time. Thanks, and